one way to hit the ground running. That was a tune that we repeatedly played for our second concert, so I opened the show with it. And that was Gabe Dodson playing both solos there. Go ahead and forgive it. And so, unfortunately, earlier we had one of our students having an accident where they really can't play as much as they could. And so Gabe filled in the other sax solo there. And then we have Tim, who I usually would introduce later in the evening, but he's here filling in the sax part that we're missing. So big shout out to Tim, who's also our combo coach on stage. I keep doing to re-raise those lights a little bit. I'm going to kind of introduce and thank everybody kind of off the rip here, and then we'll get them to run as fast as possible. First person on stage, and no need for Let's Play yet, I'll introduce them. That is Elle Wynn, our department extraordinaire. It's jack of all trades, Jill of all trades, however you want to phrase it, person of all trades. They do everything for us, including playing with some of our ensembles and copying the programs you see and all the things and all the logistics. Oh my God, what a godsend they've been. You've heard me say that all other concerts of the year. Give it up for Elle Wynn. He's also a jazz oldest of our trade and a composer of our trade. Thank you, buddy, saxophone. All right, so a couple people I want to thank who might be out in the audience, and if you feel so inclined, go ahead and stand to be recognized if you would like to do that. First off is all of our administrators. We have Superintendent Kirby. There might be in the audience somewhere. We have our district coordinator, Toya Robinson, the coordinator of Fine Arts. Our principals here at the high school, Dr. Brandon Towns, Principal Stephanie Thomas, who is our division head. Also our assistants, we have Miss Perry, Mr. Smith, and Miss Hanson. I'm sure many of those guys are in the audience. Of course, we always have our wonderful custodial and security staffs, so big shout out to them. And then, last but not least, before I get moving along here, a big shout out to our auditorium master and his students. We have Keith Newman back there working all the boards and lights, makes it sound good, look good. So big round of applause for all those folks that help keep us there. And more than all right, so our next tune, a nice little swing chart called Night Shot. See if I get them all in order. If I miss somebody, please yell at me. We have Stella Stavovi on the sax. Tony Kasuchi on the tenor sax. Lisa Didinger on the bone. Let's go find the keys. We had Dylan Cotton, I think they had Dylan's next on the bone. Ace Davis on the bone. Ray Reeves on the trumpet. Liam Alcorn on the viols. Reese Portis on the guitar. And finally, Trey Urich on the bass. All right, so that tune, like, I use that to kind of not force everybody to solo, but encourage everybody to solo, especially folks that don't take solos into the other tunes. I was like, hey, everybody's got to play well on this. We talked about the scale we could use on that one and the chords, and I think they did a fine job, especially some folks that might have outside of their comfort zone. And it's scary to do that the first time, and they all did a wonderful job. All right, if you're new to this, and especially middle school parents, I want you to pay attention to this part. If you think your child doesn't have room in their schedule for jazz, then you are incorrect. It might be full and they have a lunch on there. A lot of our students, because they want to just play and they enjoy coming down during the band room during part of their lunch period, they do what was called jazz lunch. They come and they play the tunes you just heard, and then the other ones we hear later, we worked on those. And then when they leave, we do another tune with people who are regular jazz on their schedule. And the last couple of years, it's worked out where we've had a combo with the kids. So long story short, we do a combo piece, and how we do this is we play a fun game called Real Book Roulette. The Real Book there's at least 2 volumes more than that. But the 2 that we have in department, we put a number generator on. There's 500 tunes per book, so like we pick book 1, book 2, pick out of 400. It's a good way to just practice different styles as we play. And then we finally let more play for jazz night, and we settled on this one. This is called Another Star. It's one of the tunes on Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life. And we're also going to feature one of our violists in our department, but also a fine vocalist in the BMP, Jet Levitt, who's going to come and sing part of the backgrounds for this one as well. So this is Another Star by Stevie Wonder. our soloists on that one, make the right order. Gabe think went first, Gabe Dotson, Stella Stavovi, you go first, whatever. Stella went first, Stella Stavovi, Gabe Dotson, Ace Davis, Dylan Clark, Bruce Forbes, and Evan Hayes. Once again, give it for Jet for singing with us. All right, so one of the things that I am blessed to have here, and this program has been blessed with a lot of good things over the years, and one of them is the fact that we get to do a combo class as a 9th period. So students get to engage in jazz in what's more the professional, pre-professional kind of setting where you have 3, 4, 5 people in this kind of setup. But a lot of groups meet once a week, maybe more on their own, but once a week with Tim, who I already introduced. But we are also blessed to have lots of people working with these students and helping them out. One person that might be in the audience too that I haven't mentioned yet, he worked with our drummers, and you hear them all night. Our percussion instructor, Joseph Fox, comes and works with our drummers, and he's one of 2 of our alumni that comes and helps out. But the other one that I've already introduced, and is Tim. And so basically, I don't do much with the combos. I do more of the chamber music while at the same time that's going on. And Tim kind of takes the lead with our combos. I sit in and give advice and listen in. Like last night, I was teching the group that was on stage here for the show and all that kind of thing. But most of the work you hear is through Tim. And you're going to hear some pretty awesome combos tonight, the first of which they'll introduce themselves after their first song. But before I pull Tim off here and have those guys start, one more round of applause for our helpers in the department. We have Joseph Fox and, of course, Mr. McDonald. Let's turn applause for those guys. Here's another wave. There he is. All right, so our first combo will start playing here in a second.
Hi. We are Mrs. Cream. We got Peregrine on the guitar, Logan on the bass, Liam on the drums, and me also on the guitar. And we're gonna play you 2 songs tonight. Our first one is April Joy by Pat Metheny. Now we're going to invite out Stella and Rolla to play Skate You by Snarky Puppy.
Hey, they got everything figured out. So, I was lucky enough a couple years ago to be on the hiring committee for our wonderful 2 instrumental teachers at Roxborough, one of whom you see in front of you now. I'll let her introduce her group. But this is the amazing middle school band director at Roxmid, Katie Malquist.
So this is our Roxborough Middle School Jazz Band, which is in year 2 of being restarted after COVID and everything. And I can confidently say that this is one of the most enthusiastic group of musicians I've ever worked with. Can you raise your hand if this is your first year in the jazz band? Raise your hand if you're a 6th grader. Raise your hand if you're a 7th grader. And raise your hand if you're an 8th grader. So when we started it back up, I was looking for a space for kids to be able to come and play a little bit of extra music, if they wanted to play harder music and everything. And that was what I was expecting, and that's exactly what we got. What I wasn't expecting was what a mentoring program has kind of turned into. So getting to see our 8th graders, who are now my first group that I've had all the way through from when they were in 6th grade, turn into mentors for their younger students, and getting to see all of the different siblings. Raise your hand if you're a sibling who's also in jazz band. We've got several. Really come together. It's really turned into a really neat family that I couldn't be more proud of. So this is the Roxmid Jazz Band. That was Wolverine Blues with soloist 6th grade Olivia Ergun and 8th grader Nala Moore. Phoenix Christensen, Olivia Airgood, Aaliyah Reeves, Blaze Lilly, Nala Moore, and Lana Gray, and Damian Roberts. That's but certainly not me. So this will be our last piece, the big band chart, Sing, Sing, Sing. If you would like to catch the jazz band for their final performance of the year, they'll be performing at Rocks Mid on Tuesday, May 13th at 6 p.m. at Rocks Mid.
Let's give it up one more time for the Rocky Mitchell Jazz. That was great. I hope they can hear that from me. That was awesome. I hope they can hear it, and Katie can hear the story, but we were backstage, and we were just, the kids were up back there talking. Yeah, high school, you can come out once you're ready. Come on, high school. And like, one of the kids goes, man, they sound so good. I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. So I think that the future here at Heights High looks pretty bright in the music programs. And I'm excited. So Yeah, I think there's one more group that I want to, as these guys come on stage, I don't do this at all or enough, and I want to acknowledge all the parents and the families out there, because it's thanks to you guys that these guys either get lessons or get instruments. If you guys can, afford them, you rent them, and you bring them, and especially with the middle school, they come after school. High school, they come do the jazz combo program after school. So give yourselves, families and parents and guardians especially, a round of applause for all you do for these kids. I know teachers really appreciate that. All right, so we got one more big band set here before we do our last two combos in the finale. Word of note to our alumni and other committee members in the audience who are going to play with us for the finale, go ahead and come backstage after the second to last combo. So once Tiger Drop does their thing before Dumpster Fire comes on stage, I thought I'd say that phrase in a school concert. Here we are, before Dumpster Fire burns up our stage here. That's when the alumni can come kind of join us backstage and get ready for our finale jam, and we'll get ready for that later. All right, I think we're pretty much all set up. We got a couple more people joining us here for the chicken, but it's a nice little funk tune here we're working on. I think Tim's gonna join us on stage and play with us. This is Jaco Pastorius' The Chicken. That was our speaker Jay Johnson on the saxophone. And Brandon Hayes getting on those keys. Sweet. All right, our last big band chart here before we get back to our combos. This is a song called Another Zyto Beto. It invokes a couple of different styles from New Orleans jazz. There's some Zydeco, and there's some second line tunes. You know what that is? That's what they play basically in the New Orleans parades. Is what New Orleans jazz is known for, those second line kind of styles. And you're gonna hear some tuba playing on this as well. Not as a solo, but as our bass line, which is traditional for the parades. You have a sousaphone player playing the bass line. This is Another Zyto Beto. We have Dave Johnson on the saxophone once again. Brandon Hayes on the flugelhorn, I believe, this time, if not the trumpet. Yeah, flugel. Sweet. And then I want to give a special shout out, anybody probably doesn't want me to. Fergus Donnelly is the student that's been missing some things tonight just because he actually injured himself earlier, but he still is here to play with his one good hand. So shout out to Fergus for being a trooper, left-handing that. That was amazing. All right, so we got 2 more combos and then our finales. Once again, if you are joining us for our mass finale, whether you're a community member and or alumni, the time to get ready is between this next combo and the last one. More set change. So, before Rob gets completely, I mean, he's off stage, but that's all right. I do want to acknowledge, and I should have before he came up here, my fault. I want to thank BOPO for all that they do for our students. I don't think, if you don't realize this, and a lot of those parents probably don't know, because of the work they did getting donations, and the donations probably by some folks in the audience right now, that tour cost to New York that we took, I think, what, 2/3 of what it would have cost out of pocket for the students, something to that effect. And then other students who could afford less, they reached out and provided scholarships for those students as well. So big shout out from all the work BOPO does, from uniforms and tour help and everything you see. Let's give a round of applause to all the people in BOPO who helped. Rob's leadership has been immense this year, and I mean, we've had some good presidents in a row that I've been blessed and lucky to work with, so we are thankful for their help and everything that they have done. One thing I do want to add and ask of you, for years, this concert especially was a paid concert. When Mr. Heim and when I came along and Mr. Heim and I were discussing maybe some changes to the department and things that I wanted to see happen, and we both wanted to see, one of the first changes that we made is every single concert you hear at the high school from the instrumental music department, completely free to you as families and to you as people coming to watch these fine young students. In lieu of that ticket price, if you find it so willing, it used to be I think $5 a ticket or something to that effect. Please go to, is it heightsbopo.org/donate? So Heights, BOPO.org, heightsbopo.org/donate. And there you can, if you feel so willing to donate to the $5 per ticket that you might feel, or whatever you feel that you can, or if you would like to, in lieu of those ticket donations, something we probably say for every concert, but then that money, as you heard, goes straight back to our kids and to our programs. So if you feel so willing to do that, we'd appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you to BOPO again. All right, moving on with the program, because we're going to keep moving. Our next combo.
Hello. We are Tiger Drop, and my name is Gabe Dodson. I'm playing tenor sax. We got Brandon Hayes on the keys. Fergus was gonna play alto sax, but he injured his hand, so he played a little bass solo on the piano. Then we got Logan Alcorn on the bass, and Liam Alcorn on the drums. So that was a little song called Chick's Pain. It inspired by a famous tune you may know. It's called Spain by Chick Corea. Anyways, so our next song, it's from a movie that was made about 2 years ago named Blue Giant. And so, you could say that song is pretty new. Anyway, let's get back into it. So, my name's Gabe Dodson, and this is new.
Before our last combo goes out, this is our last call for anybody who's going to come join us on stage for our finale. Come on backstage, all those alumni and such. And we're here, our last combo.
So we are Dumpster Fire, and the song we just played was called Recordame. And the next song that we're gonna play is called Some Skunk Funk. Yeah, so I'm Antonia, and I'm playing with Barry, and then Stella over here is on the soprano. We have Henry on the piano and the keyboard, and we have Milo on the bass, and then we have Dana on the drums.
A little like mass chaos here at the end, get everybody on stage, and we have some extra alumni joining us and stuff. We don't know who's going to show up for the alumni, so we got to make sure we got everything going. Before we do that, let's have one more big hand for all of our combos and Mr. McDonald and all of his work tonight with all that. Good job, guys. I'm going to brag on that last week a little bit. Stella Antonia and Milo are all seniors, and they've been in the company for like 3 years. I think I asked them 3 years ago to play some Skunk Funk, and they finally capitulated. And I think you realize how, most of you probably do, but if you don't, that is a tough tune. They just nailed it. So big shout out to all the combos again. Also big shout out to our middle school program at Rocks Mid. It's on the playing. You guys heard backstage when you came off, and I said you sounded great. I'll tell you again while you're out there and hopefully listening. So good job to you. All right, so this has been kind of a tradition here since I took over 5 years ago. Where we do a little bit of a mass jam at the end. So instead of, and it's kind of fun to play more of a jazz adjacent, jazz inspired sometimes. So we did Chameleon one year for our big 100th anniversary concert. We did some version of September, which ended up being 30 clicks too fast, and it was like great, it sounded awesome. What else have we done? Last year we did Vehicle. So this year I decided, I was looking around, took me forever. We finally found this piece that we kind of rearranged and put in just to make middle schoolers have a good parts to play, and so our alumni. If you don't know, James Brown was kind of like this stepping stone between the old jazz influence, because pretty much all American popular music starts with the blues and then jazz, and then it all kind of goes out from there to everything else. And his drummer, Jabbo Starks, I think he's the original drummer for this track, I could be wrong, but for I Got You, I Feel Good, was the most sampled drummer in the early days of hip hop, and still might be the most sampled drummer for a lot of hip hop beats. So there's a clear through line from what is very popular today to what was popular then to what was popular in the past. So I thought this was a perfect piece for us to end on, to kind of represent all those things. So once we get, I think we're almost quite there. We're gonna play some I Got You, I Feel Good. All right, I think we're just about there. All right, now we'll go back on stage. One more round of applause for all students who performed tonight so far. One more round of applause for and our high school students involved in our jazz program. All right, think we're ready. I Got You, I Feel Good. probably not the soloist. If I miss somebody, please forgive me. We had Gabe Dotson starting off there. You heard him once tonight. Woo, Gabe. Juniper Hare. How about Juniper? I said class of 2030 because I'm going to talk about the alumni. Class of 23, Jack Keller. I think he was next. Did you take one, Tamara? I can't remember. What? Did you take one? I can't remember, honestly. It was so quick. No. We had Dave Collins, class of 23. Yeah. Tamara take one? Tamara, class of 24. I thought you did. Julian, class of 24. Julian Grimm on the guitar. Tim, class of, I don't know, he's old like me. I think 2005. He's old 5. Is that right before Brandon? Then Brandon, oh, I think Tamir class of 24, yeah. Yeah, weird. Yeah, I said Tamir class of 24. Well, I had the pleasure of seeing with Nate and conference students together, which was awesome, Cleveland State. Jack's studying jazz at CCM right now, so some of our final alumni doing some fine things in the world. Julian's going to study music in the near future, I do believe, if I'm mistaken, or Defiance just gigging around playing. And last but not least, we have Brandon Hayes on the keys to round us up. Thank you again, guys. It was an awesome show. Have a great night. We'll see you hopefully, see you in the reception. Good night.